We've all walked past someone in need on a dark street, instinctively quickening our pace, wondering if we should stop. But when 22-year-old Clara Brooks knelt in the freezing slush of a South Boston alleyway to help a disoriented, bleeding old man, she didn't just risk her own safety. She unknowingly triggered a chain of events that would violently upend the hidden supernatural underworld. She thought she was saving a confused dementia patient named Adrian. She had no idea she was cradling Lord Alaric, the ancient father of Davis Corvinus, the most ruthless vampire king in North America. By the time Clara realized the horrifying truth, the monsters were already at her door, and the king was demanding her heart. The wind whipping off Boston Harbor felt like it was composed of shattered glass. Clara Brooks pulled her threadbare wool coat tighter around her frail shoulders, the thin material doing absolutely nothing to stop the December chill. It was 3:14 a.m. She had just finished a brutal 14-hour double shift at Gracie's Diner on 4th Street, a greasy spoon that catered exclusively to insomniacs, long-haul truckers, and people who had nowhere else to be. Her feet throbbed in her worn-out sneakers, and the eviction notice taped to her apartment door 3 days ago loomed heavy in her exhausted mind. She took the shortcut through the narrow, unlit alleyway behind the old meatpacking plant. It was dangerous, a fact Clara was intimately aware of, but the freezing rain was beginning to turn into heavy, blinding sleet. She just wanted to get to a radiator, even if it only hissed lukewarm air. Halfway down the alley, a low, wet cough broke the silence. Clara froze, her hand instinctively gripping the canister of pepper spray in her pocket. She squinted through the gloom. Next to a row of overflowing industrial dumpsters, a figure was slumped against the frozen brick wall. It was an old man. He was dressed entirely wrong for the weather, and the century. He wore a heavy, torn velvet coat that looked like it belonged in a museum, trimmed with ruined silver embroidery. His stark white hair was plastered to his forehead with a mixture of sleet and something dark, thick, and slick. Blood. "Hey," Clara called out softly, her breath pluming in the icy air. "Sir, are you all right?" The old man's head lolled to the side. His skin was impossibly pale, possessing a translucent quality, like fine porcelain held up to a harsh light. When he opened his eyes, Clara gasped. They were a milky, clouded silver, unfocused and wild with pain. "The wolves!" he rasped, his voice a dry, papery wheeze. "They breached the perimeter! Cassius!" Dementia, Clara thought, her heart twisting with a profound, aching pity. He was having an episode, lost and hallucinating in the freezing cold. She had dealt with similar situations with her late grandmother. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees in the slush, uncaring that the freezing water soaked straight through her jeans. "Okay, let's get you up. We need to get you to Massachusetts, General. You're bleeding." When she touched his shoulder, the old man flinched violently, a surprisingly strong, cold hand gripping her wrist like a vice. For a split second, Clara felt a terrifying jolt of raw, inhuman power radiate from his touch, but then the energy collapsed and he slumped forward, leaning heavily against her. "No hospitals," he breathed, his grip weakening. "No human doctors. They will find me. Please, hide me." Clara hesitated. Taking a bleeding, strange man to a cramped apartment on Tremont Street was the height of stupidity. But the blood seeping through his velvet coat was unnaturally dark, almost black in the dim light, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. If she left him to call an ambulance, he would freeze to death before the paramedics arrived. "All right," Clara muttered, hauling his arm over her shoulder. He was incredibly heavy, feeling less like flesh and bone and more like solid marble. "Come on, Adrian. Let's call you Adrian. I live 2 blocks away." The journey to a basement apartment was agonizing. The man she called Adrian drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering in a language Clara didn't recognize. It sounded guttural, ancient, like Latin mixed with something older and sharper. Once inside her damp, cramped studio, she laid him carefully on her narrow futon. The stark overhead light revealed the true extent of his injuries. His throat was heavily bruised, but more alarming were the 3 deep, parallel lacerations across his chest. They didn't look like knife wounds. They looked like claw marks from a massive animal. Clara fetched her meager first aid kit, some warm water, and clean towels. "I have to clean these, Adrian. It's going to sting." She gently wiped away the congealed, blackish blood. As she did, she witnessed something that made her breath catch in her throat. The jagged, terrifying wounds were shifting. The edges of the flesh were slowly knitting together, a faint, almost imperceptible hiss rising from the damaged tissue. Clara stumbled backward, knocking over the bowl of water. "What?" she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. Adrian's silver eyes locked onto hers. The milky cloudiness had receded, revealing irises that shimmered with a profound, ageless intelligence. "You have a kind heart, child of the ephemeral," he said softly, his voice suddenly clear and resonant, completely devoid of the frailty he possessed moments ago. "It is a rare currency in this wretched era." Clara backed up until her shoulders hit the cheap plaster wall. "What are you?" she demanded, terror finally overriding her empathy. Adrian slowly sat up. The bleeding had completely stopped. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a heavy, dark silver signet ring. It bore a crest, a snarling wolf entwined with a bat set against a ruby teardrop. He placed it on Clara's small, chipped coffee table. "I am a man who was betrayed by his own, saved by a stranger," Adrian said, standing up. He moved with a sudden, fluid grace that defied his elderly appearance. "Keep this. It is a mark of my debt. Should the shadows ever seek to swallow you, show them this crest, and they will bow." Before Clara could scream, before she could grab her phone to call the police, Adrian turned to the small, barred window of her basement apartment. The heavy iron bars groaned, bending outward as if made of soft clay, and with a blur of motion so fast Clara's eyes couldn't track it, he was gone. The freezing wind howled through the broken window, the only proof he had ever been there being the ruined bowl of water and the heavy silver ring resting on her table. A week passed. Clara desperately tried to convince herself she had hallucinated the entire encounter. Sleep deprivation, the stress of her overdue rent, the fumes from the diner's deep fryer. Anything was a more logical explanation than an old man healing instantly and bending iron bars with his bare hands. She had taped cardboard over her broken window and pawned her mother's necklace to pay the rent, desperately trying to return to her bleak, normal life. But the silver ring sat on her bedside table, a heavy, silent anchor to the impossible. On a dreary Thursday afternoon, Clara was wiping down the laminate counter at Grace's diner when her manager, Pete, came out of the back office looking pale and sweating profusely. "Clara," Pete said, his voice trembling, "grab your coat. You're done." Clara paused, the dirty rag in her hand. "What? Pete, my shift doesn't end for another 4 hours. No, I mean you're done. Fired. Let go. Here's your final week's pay in cash." He shoved a thin envelope across the counter. He wouldn't look her in the eye. "Pete, you can't do this." "I need this job," Clara pleaded, her stomach dropping. "I can't afford the trouble, Clara," Pete whispered, glancing nervously out the diner's large front window. Those men. They came in asking for the girl who worked the late shift last Tuesday, the one who walked home down the alley. They bought the building, Clara, this whole block, in cash, an hour ago. "The only condition was that I terminate you immediately. I'm sorry." Clara followed Pete's gaze. Parked across the street, idling smoothly in the rain, were 3 identical, jet-black, heavily armored Maybachs. Standing beside the lead car was a man in a bespoke charcoal suit, holding a black umbrella. He wasn't looking at the diner. He was looking directly at her. Panic seized Clara, the men who had attacked Adrian. They had found her. She didn't bother arguing with Pete. She grabbed her coat and bolted out the back door, sprinting down the greasy alleyway. Her lungs burned as she ran through the rain, taking every convoluted back street and shortcut she knew. She had to get to her apartment, grab her emergency stash of cash, and get out of the city. She burst into her building, taking the steps down to the basement 2 at a time. She jammed her key into the lock, shoved the door open, and froze. Sitting elegantly on her cheap futon, flanked by two massive men in dark suits, was the most terrifyingly beautiful man Clara had ever seen. He looked to be in his late 20s, though his eyes, dark, brooding, and flecked with an unnatural crimson, held a coldness that felt centuries old. He wore a tailored midnight blue suit that probably cost more than Clara would earn in a decade. His cheekbones were sharp enough to cut glass, and his dark hair was impeccably styled. But it was the sheer, suffocating aura of power rolling off him that pinned Clara to the spot. It felt like standing too close to a roaring jet engine. "Clara Brooks," the man said. His voice was a rich, dark baritone that vibrated in her chest. It wasn't a question. Clara's eyes darted to the table. The silver ring was gone. The man held it between his long, pale fingers, turning it over thoughtfully. "Who are you?" Clara managed to choke out, her hand inching towards the door handle behind her. "Get out of my apartment before I scream." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Scream if you wish. The tenants above you were relocated an hour ago. You and I are quite alone, Miss Brooks. I am Davis Corvinus." The name meant nothing to her, but the way he said it suggested it should have brought her to her knees. "You aided an old man last week," Davis continued, standing up. He towered over her, closing the distance between them with that same unnatural, predatory grace Adrian had displayed. "You brought him here. You cleaned wounds inflicted by lichen claws, and you kept his signet ring." I didn't know who he was," Clara stammered, terrified. "He was hurt." "He is Lord Alaric Corvinus," Davis stated softly, stopping inches from her face. Clara could smell his cologne, something expensive, smelling of cedar, dark spices, and copper. "He is my father, and he is the former king of our kind." Clara's mind short-circuited. "Your kind? King? You're insane. Both of you are insane." Davis's eyes flared, the crimson overtaking the dark irises for a terrifying second. He reached out, his cold fingers gently but firmly gripping her chin, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. "You have stumbled into a war that has raged in the shadows for a millennium, Clara," Davis murmured. "The faction that ambushed my father, the Sanguine Brotherhood, tracked his blood to this pathetic dwelling. They know you touched him. They know you saw him. To them, you are a loose end. To me, you are a profound inconvenience who has inadvertently placed my house in your debt." "I don't want your debt," Clara shoved his hand away, surprising herself with her own audacity. "I want you out of my life. I lost my job today because of you." "I bought the diner to sever your ties to this location," Davis corrected coolly. "A necessary precaution. Felix," he addressed one of the massive men standing by the futon, "gather her essential belongings. We are leaving." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Clara yelled, finally turning to run. Before she could take a single step, Davis was in front of her, blocking the door. He hadn't walked. He had simply arrived there. He looked down at her, his expression a mix of annoyance and grim resolve. "You can either walk to the car, Miss Brooks, or I can render you unconscious and carry you. The choice is yours, but make no mistake. If you stay here tonight, you will be torn apart by Cassius's assassins before sunrise. My father decreed you be protected. As king, I honor his debts." Clara looked into his inhuman eyes, reading the absolute, uncompromising truth in them. Her normal life was over. The monsters were real, and the king had just laid claim to her. The Corvinus estate was not a house. It was a fortress, masked as a Gilded Age masterpiece. Tucked deep into the secluded, heavily forested Berkshire Hills, hours away from Boston, the sprawling limestone mansion sat behind 30-foot wrought-iron gates and high stone walls. As the Maybach crunched along the gravel driveway, Clara stared out of the tinted window, her dread mounting with every passing mile. Upon arrival, she was escorted not to a dungeon, but to a suite of rooms that defied her comprehension of wealth. Silk tapestries, a roaring fireplace, and a massive 4-poster bed draped in velvet awaited her. A young woman in a modest black dress, who introduced herself as Abigail, had drawn a hot bath and laid out silk nightclothes. "If you need anything, Miss Brooks, you have but to ring the bell," Abigail had said, her eyes respectfully lowered. Clara noticed how pale Abigail was, and the faint, almost invisible puncture scars on the side of her neck. For 3 days, Clara was a prisoner in paradise. She was fed gourmet meals, allowed to roam the vast labyrinthine library, and walked the expansive, manicured gardens, always flanked by 2 silent, hulking security guards. But she was not allowed a phone, internet access, or permission to leave the grounds. She hated it. The gilded cage only amplified her anxiety. She missed the chaotic noise of the city, the grueling satisfaction of earning her meager tips. She hated feeling helpless. Most of all, she hated her confusing encounters with Davis. He summoned her to his private study on the 4th evening. The room was dark, lit only by a massive fireplace, and the moonlight spilling through floor-to-ceiling windows. Davis stood by the glass, looking out over the dark forest, a glass of dark, crimson liquid in his hand. "Are the accommodations to your liking, Miss Brooks?" he asked without turning around. "They're a vast improvement over my basement, Your Majesty," Clara replied, lacing her voice with heavy sarcasm. She stood near the door, refusing to sit in the plush leather chairs. "But a cage is a cage. When can I leave?" Davis finally turned. The firelight caught the sharp angles of his face, casting deep, dramatic shadows. He looked exhausted, the weight of his crown visible in the tension of his jaw. "Cassius's hounds are still searching the city for you," Davis said, walking toward his massive oak desk. "They tortured your former landlord yesterday. He told them everything he knew, which, thankfully, was nothing." Clara's breath hitched. "Mr. Henderson, is he—" "He is alive," Davis said, his tone flat. "My men intervened before they could finish the job." "But it proves my point. You are not safe." "Why do they care so much about me?" Clara demanded, stepping forward, her frustration boiling over. "I'm just a waitress. I put a bandage on an old man." Davis slammed his glass down on the desk, the sharp crack echoing in the quiet room. He closed the distance between them in a heartbeat, leaning down so his face was level with hers. Clara stood her ground, though her knees shook. "Because my father's blood is potent," Davis hissed softly. "Because by tending to his open wounds, you were exposed to it. Cassius believes you might have retained a trace of his bloodline's energy, or that my father entrusted you with state secrets. They do not view you as a waitress, Clara. They view you as an asset to be extracted and then discarded." He paused, his crimson-flecked eyes roaming over her face, searching for something. "You possess a maddening lack of self-preservation," he murmured, the anger draining from his voice, replaced by a strange, quiet fascination. "Any other human would be cowering, begging for immortality or wealth. Yet you just want to return to a life of poverty and cold." "I want my freedom," Clara shot back, staring directly into his eyes. "I don't belong here." "Oh, the little stray speaks truth," a melodic, cruel voice drawled from the doorway. Clara turned. Leaning against the heavy oak doors was a woman of staggering, ethereal beauty. She wore a backless crimson gown that clung to her curves like a second skin. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect vintage waves, and her eyes were a piercing, icy blue. She looked at Clara the way one might look at a cockroach on a dining table. "Lady Genevieve," Davis said, his voice instantly turning to ice. "You were not announced." Genevieve sauntered into the room, her eyes never leaving Clara. "Forgive me, Davis, darling, but the court is whispering. The king brings a filthy human off the streets and houses her in the royal wing. They wonder if she is your new blood cattle, or merely a passing eccentricity." Genevieve stopped in front of Clara, invading her personal space. The vampire's scent was overpowering, heavy roses and decaying sweetness. "She doesn't smell like anything special, just fear and cheap soap." "Enough," Davis commanded. The sheer force of the single word made the heavy crystal chandelier above them rattle. Genevieve pouted, stepping back. "Protecting your pets so fiercely, my king? Cassius is massing forces on the southern border, and you play house with a mortal. My military strategies are not your concern, Genevieve. Leave us. Now." Genevieve offered a mock curtsy, her icy eyes flashing with pure malice as she looked at Clora one last time. "Watch your back, little stray. Mansions are so very large. It's easy to get lost and have an accident." She vanished from the room in a blur of crimson silk. Clora let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Her heart was racing. The hostility from Genevieve wasn't just jealousy. It was lethal. "Ignore her," Davis said quietly, stepping closer to Clora. The coldness in his demeanor had fractured, revealing a protective instinct that caught Clora entirely off guard. Genevieve is a relic of the old court, vain and harmless. "She didn't look harmless to me," Clora whispered. "You are under my protection," Davis stated, his voice a low, resonant vow that sent an involuntary shiver down Clora's spine. He reached out, his knuckles lightly brushing against her cheek. His skin was freezing, yet it left a burning trail across her skin. "No one in this estate will harm you. That is my word." Before Clora could process the strange, intimate gesture, a deafening explosion rocked the mansion. The floor violently shuddered, throwing Clora off balance. Davis caught her by the waist, his grip iron-tight. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the study shattered inward, a storm of glass raining down as the blare of a perimeter breach alarm began to shriek through the estate. "They're here," Davis growled, pulling Clora behind him as his eyes flared a brilliant, terrifying crimson, and his fangs descended. "Stay behind me." The sheer concussive force of the explosion shattered the remaining glass in the study, sending a lethal rain of jagged shards across the Persian rugs. Clora threw her arms over her face, expecting to be flayed alive, but the impact never came. Davis had moved with a speed that defied physics, wrapping his large, tailored frame around her. The glass struck his back and shoulders, shredding the expensive wool of his suit, but he didn't so much as flinch. "Felix!" Davis roared, his voice possessing a strange, dual-layered resonance that vibrated the very floorboards. The massive guard materialized in the doorway, hauling a heavy, matte black tactical rifle. This wasn't a standard firearm. The barrel was abnormally wide, and a faint UV blue light pulsed from the magazine. "Perimeter compromised on the east wing, sire," Felix reported, his voice remarkably calm given the chaos. A mix of sanguine mercenaries and rogue Lycans. They used concentrated thermite to melt the iron gates. Captain Reynolds is holding the main foyer, but we are outnumbered 3-1. "Genevieve," Davis spat the name like a curse, his crimson eyes narrowing. The wards were keyed to royal blood. Cassius couldn't have breached the physical perimeter unless someone on the inside disrupted the kinetic barriers. "Find her, Felix. If she resists, take her head." "Yes, sire." Felix vanished into the smoke-filled corridor. Davis grabbed Clora's hand. His grip was freezing, yet it anchored her to reality as the world dissolved into madness. "Stay close. Do not let go of my hand, Clora. If we are separated, you will not survive the next 10 minutes. He pulled her into the hallway. The majestic Corvinus estate had been transformed into a war zone. The scent of ozone, burning wood, and the sharp, metallic tang of blood hung heavy in the air. Down the grand, sweeping staircase, Clora caught glimpses of impossible violence. Men and women moving in terrifying blurs clashed with massive, hulking figures that were half human, half wolf. The sounds of tearing flesh and bone-rattling snarls echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Suddenly the floorboards beneath them splintered. A Lycan, standing over 7 feet tall and covered in coarse, ash-grey fur, erupted from the floor below, its massive jaws snapping inches from Clora's face. The beast reeked of wet earth and copper. Before Clora could even scream, Davis stepped into the beast's path. He didn't use a weapon. He caught the Lycan's massive jaws with his bare hands, his muscles straining against the tailored fabric of his ruined suit. With a guttural roar of his own, Davis twisted his wrists viciously. A sickening crack echoed through the hall, and the massive beast slumped backward, its neck completely broken. Clora stared in absolute horror. The sheer, brutal disparity in strength was unfathomable. This was the man who had been sipping scotch and politely arguing with her 5 minutes ago. "Keep moving," Davis barked, pulling her toward a set of heavy, reinforced oak doors at the end of the corridor. As they reached the doors, a figure dropped from the ceiling rafters, landing silently between them and their escape route. It was a man clad in dark tactical gear, his face obscured by a ballistic mask. He held a sleek, modified submachine gun. "The king and the human," the assassin hissed, his voice artificially distorted. "Cassius sends his regards." He pulled the trigger. Davis shoved Clora hard against the wall, throwing his body entirely in front of hers. The deafening roar of automatic fire filled the enclosed space. Clora watched in terror as Davis jerked backward, absorbing 3 rounds directly into his chest. These were not ordinary bullets. The moment they impacted his flesh, a blinding, searing white light erupted from the entry wounds. The smell of burning flesh instantly overpowered the smoke in the air. Davis let out a roar of absolute agony. A sound so raw and pained it brought tears to Clara's eyes. He lunged forward despite the grievous injuries, his hand piercing straight through the assassin's tactical vest and ribcage. He ripped the man's heart out in a single, fluid motion, tossing the lifeless body aside like a broken toy. Davis collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest. The white light was still sizzling inside his wounds, eating away at his tissue. "Davis!" Clora dropped to the floor beside him, her hands hovering over his chest, terrified to touch the burning injuries. "Oh my God, what is that? What do I do?" Phosphorus-laced silver, infused with concentrated UV resin, Davis gasped, his crimson eyes wide with shock and pain. Black veins were beginning to spiderweb up his neck, poisoning his immortal system. Experimental sanguine weaponry. It stops the cellular regeneration. "We need to get you help," Clora yelled, frantically looking around the empty, ruined hallway. "No time," he wheezed, his head lolling against the wall. He reached up, his bloody hand weakly grasping the brass handle of the oak door. He turned it in a specific, complex sequence. The wall beside the door hissed, sliding open to reveal a pitch-black, narrow stone stairwell plunging deep into the earth. "The catacombs! Get us inside!" Clora didn't hesitate. Adrenaline masking her sheer terror, she hauled Davis's arm over her shoulder. He was incredibly heavy, his body feeling like solid granite. But the primal fear of the encroaching monsters gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. She dragged him into the darkness, and the stone wall seamlessly slid shut behind them, cutting off the sounds of the massacre above. The descent into the catacombs was a nightmare. The air grew damp and tasted of ancient dust and crushed limestone. Emergency luminescent strips flared to life along the baseboards, casting an eerie, pale green glow over the rough-hewn stone walls. Clora practically carried Davis down the winding stairs. His breathing had become ragged, a wet, rattling sound that terrified her more than the monsters upstairs. They finally reached a heavy iron door at the bottom. Davis, barely conscious, pressed his bloody palm against a hidden biometric scanner. The door groaned open, revealing a large, circular chamber. It was a stark contrast to the medieval stairs, a state-of-the-art medical facility and panic room hidden deep beneath the Berkshire Mountains. Stainless steel tables, refrigerated blood banks, and monitors lined the walls. Clora dragged him onto the nearest examination table. The bright surgical lights overhead revealed the horrific extent of his injuries. The 3 bullet holes in his chest were actively burning, the edges of the wounds glowing with an angry, unnatural bluish-white light. The black veins had reached his jawline. "Clora," Davis whispered, his voice barely a breath. His eyes were locked onto hers, the crimson fading into a dull, cloudy grey. In the cabinet, surgical tongs. "You have to extract the shrapnel. The silver is blocking my healing factor." "I'm not a doctor," Clora cried, her hands shaking violently as she rushed to the glass cabinets, pulling out a tray of sterilized steel instruments. "I wait tables, Davis. I don't know how to do this." "You saved my father," he rasped, coughing up a mouthful of black blood. "You have the instinct. Please, Before the UV resin reaches my heart. Clara swallowed her panic. She took a deep breath, forcing her trembling hands to steady. She grabbed a pair of long, forceps-like tongs and stepped up to the table. Looking down at his ruined chest, she felt a profound surge of empathy. King or monster, he was dying right in front of her, and he had taken those bullets to save her life. "This is going to hurt," she warned, her voice dropping to a serious, commanding register she rarely used. "I have endured worse centuries before you were born," Davis gritted out, gripping the edges of the steel table so hard the metal dented. "Do it!" Clara plunged the tongs into the first glowing wound. Davis let out a strangled, agonizing groan, his body arching off the table. Clara gritted her teeth, ignoring the horrific, sizzling sound and the smell of burning flesh. She dug deep, her fingers slick with his dark, cold blood, until she felt the hard scrape of metal against the tongs. She clamped down and pulled. A jagged, glowing silver bullet was extracted from his flesh, dropping onto the steel tray with a heavy clatter. Instantly, the white light in that specific wound extinguished, and the blackened edges began to knit together, albeit slowly. She repeated the brutal process twice more, her hands and forearms coated in his blood. By the time the third bullet hit the tray, Clara was sobbing quietly from the sheer stress, and Davis was completely still, his chest rising and falling in shallow, exhausted breaths. Clara grabbed a clean towel, soaking it in a basin of sterile saline, and began to gently wipe away the ruined blood from his chest, just as she had done for his father. As she worked, she noticed something incredible. Where her bare, blood-slicked fingers brushed against his torn skin, the sluggish regeneration process suddenly accelerated. The flesh didn't just knit, it snapped together, healing flawlessly, leaving behind smooth, unblemished skin. The black veins retreating down his neck vanished entirely. Davis's eyes snapped open. The dull grey was gone, replaced by a vibrant, startlingly bright crimson. He looked down at his chest, then at Clara's hands, a look of profound, unadulterated shock breaking his normally stoic features. He suddenly reached up, grabbing her wrist gently but firmly. He didn't push her away. He pressed her palm flat against the center of his chest, right over his heart. A sudden, warm rush of energy flowed from Clara's hand into his body. It felt like standing in a beam of pure sunlight. Davis let out a long, shuddering breath, his eyes closing as the last remnants of the poison were purged from his system. "Your touch," Davis murmured, his voice filled with an awe that bordered on reverence. "It accelerates the cellular matrix. It neutralizes the silver. That is impossible. Human blood is sustenance. It is not restorative." "I don't know what I'm doing," Clara whispered, trying to pull her hand back, but he held it there, his thumb lightly stroking the back of her wrist. The intimate gesture made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear. I just wanted to help. It seems, Miss Brooks, that helping is in your very genetics," a familiar dry voice echoed from the shadows of the medical bay. Clara spun around. Stepping out from the dark corridor leading deeper into the catacombs was Adrian, Lord Alaric Corvinus. He was no longer the frail, bleeding old man in the alley. He wore a sharp, tailored black suit, his white hair immaculately groomed, exuding an aura of terrifying authority that rivaled his son's. "Father," Davis said, sitting up smoothly on the table, the weakness completely banished from his frame. "The estate is breached." Genevieve turned. "I am aware," Alaric said, his silver eyes fixed intently on Clara. "Captain Reynolds has secured the upper floors. Cassius's vanguard is dead, and Genevieve has fled. But the fact that they attacked with such desperate force confirms my suspicions. Cassius wasn't just trying to tie up a loose end. He knows what she is." "What I am?" Clara backed away from the examination table, her back hitting the cold glass of a medical cabinet. "I'm a human. I'm Clara Brooks from South Boston. Stop talking about me like I'm some kind of science experiment." Alaric walked forward, his expression softening into a look of genuine sorrow. "You are Clara Brooks, but you are also the granddaughter of Dr. Margaret Brooks." Clara froze. "How do you know my grandmother's name?" Because in the winter of 1986, at Brigham and Women's Hospital, a rogue vampire was brought into the emergency room after a severe car collision, Alaric explained, his voice taking on the cadence of a historian recounting a dark legend. Your grandmother was the attending hematologist. She drew his blood. She saw the anomalies. But instead of exposing him, she protected him. She began to study the interaction between human biology and immortal ichor in secret. Davis stepped off the table, moving to stand beside his father, his eyes never leaving Clara. Dr. Harrison Caldwell, Davis supplied the name quietly. The human geneticist one she partnered with. They were looking for a way to synthesize artificial blood to end our reliance on human feeding. Precisely, Alaric nodded. But what Margaret Brooks and Dr. Caldwell discovered was far more profound. They discovered a genetic anomaly within Margaret's own bloodline, a recessive mutation they called the Caldwell-Brooks antigen. It is incredibly rare, perhaps 1 in 100 million. This antigen acts as a universal solvent and coagulant for supernatural venom. It accelerates our healing. It neutralizes silver and UV radiation. Clara's mind was spinning. You're saying, my blood is some kind of medicine for vampires? Not just medicine, Clara, Davis said, stepping closer to her. The absolute intensity in his gaze made her breath hitch. A cure for our greatest vulnerabilities. To Cassius and the Sanguine Brotherhood, you are the key to creating an immortal army that can walk in the sun and shrug off silver bullets. You are the ultimate biological weapon. Alaric placed a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. When you cleaned my wounds in the alley, Clara, the microscopic traces of your skin oils and blood sweat transferred the antigen into my torn flesh. It saved my life. And tonight, it saved my son's. Cassius won't stop, Davis stated, his jaw clenching. He reached out, his long fingers gently tucking a stray lock of hair behind Clara's ear. The coldness of his skin was entirely gone, replaced by a strange, comforting warmth. He will tear this country apart to get to you. He will hunt you to the ends of the earth. Clara looked between the ancient king and the beautiful, terrifying man who had just taken 3 burning bullets to the chest for her. The reality of her old life, the diner, the eviction notice, the lonely apartment, shattered into 1,000,000 irrecoverable pieces. So what happens now? Clara asked, her voice trembling, though she forced herself to stand tall. Do you lock me in a deeper cage down here? Keep me as your personal first aid kit? Davis's expression hardened, a fierce, possessive fire igniting in his crimson eyes. No cage, Clara. I am done playing defense. If Cassius wants a war for the Caldwell-Brooks bloodline, I will give him one that will drown the Sanguine Brotherhood in their own ashes. He stepped intimately close, his voice dropping to a low, rough whisper, meant only for her. You are not a tool to be used. You are under my protection, and I protect what is mine. The catacombs beneath the Corvinus estate became a war room. For 48 hours, Clara watched a hidden world organize itself with terrifying efficiency. Tactical maps of New England were spread across the stainless steel medical tables. Heavy crates of munitions, both conventional and arcane, were stockpiled by grim-faced vampires and massive, scarred lichen mercenaries who owed their allegiance to Lord Alaric. Davis was a force of nature. He shed the tailored suits for black combat fatigues, his natural predatory grace amplified by the lethal weapons strapped to his chest and thighs. Yet amidst the chaos of preparing for a siege, his attention constantly anchored back to Clara. He refused to let her out of his sight, moving her from the medical bay to his private, heavily shielded quarters deep within the bunker. I am not leaving you behind, Davis stated on the 3rd night, his voice echoing in the quiet stone room. He was loading silver-jacketed rounds into a heavy pistol. Cassius has retreated to his primary stronghold, the abandoned batteries at Fort Warren on George Island, right in the middle of Boston Harbor. It is a fortress. Then why are we going there? Clara asked, sitting on the edge of a cot, her fingers tracing the intricate wolf and bat crest on the silver ring Adrian had given her. If it's a fortress, it's a suicide mission. Because he has Genevieve, and he has the synthesized data she stole from our servers regarding your grandmother's research, Davis explained, stepping closer. He knelt before her, placing the heavy pistol on the floor, and took her hands in his. His skin was warm now, a stark contrast to the freezing touch she had first felt in her apartment. If I give Cassius time to replicate the Caldwell-Brooks antigen artificially, he will create an army that cannot be killed. I must cut the head off the snake tonight. Clara looked into his crimson-flecked eyes. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was being eclipsed by something else, a profound, undeniable connection to this immortal king. He had thrown himself in front of bullets for her. He had laid his vulnerability bare on a steel table. "I'm coming with you," Clara said, her voice surprisingly steady. Davis's jaw clenched. "Absolutely not. You will remain here with Felix and a dozen of my best royal guards. You are the target, Clara. Putting you on the battlefield is madness. If Cassius breaches this bunker while you're gone, I'm dead anyway," Clara countered, her grip tightening on his hands. "My blood neutralized the poison in your chest. It healed your father. If you go to war against a man who uses phosphorus-laced silver, you might need me. I won't sit in a cage waiting to see if you survive." "You said we were done playing defense." Davis stared at her, a mixture of frustration and deep, swelling admiration warring on his face. He slowly reached up, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. "You are the most infuriating, courageous human I have ever encountered. If you come, you stay behind my back at all times. You do not engage. You do not run." "Deal," Clara whispered, her breath catching as he leaned in, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. It was a seal of protection, an ancient vow rendered in modern shadows. 3 hours later, under the cover of a dense, freezing coastal fog, a fleet of silent, matte-black Zodiac boats cut through the dark waters of Boston Harbor. The Boston skyline was a distant glow of orange and white, ignorant of the supernatural armada approaching the historical stone walls of Fort Warren. Clara sat in the center of the lead boat, encased in lightweight, state-of-the-art ballistic armor Felix had provided. Davis stood at the bow, the icy wind whipping his dark hair. Beside him stood Adrian, the former king looking every bit the ruthless warlord he had once been, wielding a beautifully crafted broadsword that hummed with kinetic energy. As the boats bumped against the rocky shoreline of George Island, the silence was shattered by a deafening howl. "Lycans!" Adrian roared, leaping from the boat with impossible agility. "Cassius brought the rogue packs." The battle joined instantly. The fog transformed into a nightmare of flashing muzzles, roaring beasts, and moving blurs of impossible speed. Clara scrambled up the slippery rocks, Felix's massive hand gripping her shoulder, hauling her towards the dark, arching stone tunnels of the old fort. Davis carved a path through the sanguine mercenaries, his movements a brutal, beautiful dance of violence. He didn't just fight, he dismantled his enemies. When a massive lichen lunged for Clara, Davis intercepted it mid-air, driving a silver blade through the beast's ribcage before it could even snarl. They pushed deep into the damp, echoing granite corridors of the fort, leaving a trail of carnage in their wake. The air grew heavy with the stench of decay and old blood. Finally, they reached the central battery, a massive, cavernous room lit by harsh, portable halogen lamps. Standing in the center of the room, surrounded by a dozen elite sanguine guards, was Cassius. He was gaunt, his skin stretched tight over an aristocratic, cruel face, and his eyes were completely black, devoid of irises or whites. Beside him, looking terrified and bruised, was Genevieve. "Davis," Cassius hissed, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together. "I honestly didn't think you would risk the asset by bringing her into the lion's den. Such a foolish, emotional miscalculation. You are weak, just like your father." "You talk too much, Cassius," Davis growled, stepping forward, his body shielding Clara. "Kill the king. Cassius commanded lazily, gesturing with a pale hand. "Bring me the Gur-Imanel alive. Bleed the rest." The central battery erupted into absolute chaos. The Sanguine elite guards moved with a synchronized, lethal precision that Davis's earlier foes had lacked. Felix and Adrian engaged the flanks, their roars echoing off the vaulted granite ceilings as they clashed with Cassius's lieutenants. Davis was a blur of motion, parrying blows and returning strikes with bone-crushing force. But Cassius had not been idle. He pulled a heavy, modified repeating rifle from behind a stone pillar, a larger, more devastating version of the weapon used in the estate study. Thwump, thwump, thwump. 3 glowing, UV-infused silver rounds struck Davis in the shoulder and abdomen. The kinetic force threw the Vampire King backward, crashing violently into the damp stone wall. He crumpled to one knee, a primal roar of agony tearing from his throat as the familiar, blinding white light began to eat away at his flesh. The black veins instantly flared up his neck, much faster and more aggressive than before. Cassius had concentrated the toxin. "Davis!" Clara screamed, fighting against Felix, who had thrown an arm out to hold her back. "Stay back, Clara!" Felix barked, firing his own weapon into the fray to keep the advancing guards away from their fallen king. Cassius stalked forward, dropping the rifle and unsheathing a long, curved blade that practically vibrated with dark energy. He looked down at Davis, a cruel smile twisting his gaunt features. A tragic end to a weak dynasty. And now, the girl's blood will ensure my absolute reign. Clara watched the black poison spreading rapidly across Davis's face. He was paralyzed by the concentrated UV resin, unable to heal, unable to rise. The fear that had kept her paralyzed shattered, replaced by a fierce, desperate surge of adrenaline. She remembered the feeling of her hand on his chest in the medical bay, the rush of warmth, the sudden miraculous healing. Human blood is sustenance, it is not restorative, but hers was. It was a weapon. "Felix, let me go!" Clara yelled, driving her elbow into the massive guard's ribs. Caught off guard by the human's sudden aggression, Felix's grip loosened just enough. Clara sprinted across the open floor, dodging a spray of stray bullets and the swinging claws of a dying Lycan. She didn't have a weapon, but she had the pocket knife she used to cut boxes at the diner, still tucked in her jeans from the day she was fired. Cassius raised his blade to deliver the killing blow to Davis's neck. Clara threw herself onto the damp stone floor beside Davis. Without a second thought, she snapped open the small pocket knife and slashed it deep across the palm of her own left hand. The pain was sharp and immediate, but she ignored it as bright red blood welled up to the surface. She slammed her bleeding palm directly over Davis's mouth. "Drink!" she commanded, her voice tearing from her throat. Davis's clouded, pain-filled eyes snapped open. For a fraction of a second, his predatory instincts rebelled against the raw, pulsing scent of human blood. But the sheer, agonizing need for survival took over. His fangs descended, and he pressed his lips to her bleeding palm, taking a deep, desperate swallow of the Caldwell Brooks bloodline. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The moment Clara's blood hit his system, a shockwave of kinetic energy ripped through the room, shattering the halogen lamps and plunging the battery into near darkness. The white burning light in Davis's wounds was extinguished, as if doused by a bucket of ice water. The black veins didn't just retreat, they vanished entirely, replaced by a radiant, terrifying flush of absolute power. Davis surged to his feet, moving so fast he generated a localized sonic boom. He didn't just disarm Cassius, he shattered the ancient vampire's wrist with a single, casual strike. Cassius shrieked, stumbling backward in absolute disbelief. "What is this?" Cassius gasped, clutching his ruined arm. "That is impossible!" Davis stood tall, his eyes burning with a brilliant, blinding crimson light that illuminated the dark room. He wiped a drop of Clara's blood from his lower lip, his gaze locked onto the usurper. The power radiating from him was suffocating, heavy, and ancient. "It is the end of your rebellion, Cassius," Davis said, his voice vibrating with the combined resonance of 1,000 kings before him. Davis didn't use a weapon. He simply reached out, his hand piercing straight through Cassius's sternum. With a brutal, uncompromising twist, he extracted the sanguine leader's heart, crushing it to ash in his fist before Cassius's body even hit the floor. Silence fell over the cavernous room, the remaining sanguine elite witnessing their invincible leader slaughtered in seconds by a supercharged king, dropped their weapons, falling to their knees in absolute surrender. Genevieve, cowering behind a stone pillar, sobbed in terror. Davis turned back to Clara. The terrifying glowing aura began to subside, his eyes returning to their normal, dark, crimson-flecked hue. He dropped to his knees beside her, gently taking her wounded, bleeding hand in his. "You foolish, brave, incredible woman," he murmured, his voice trembling with an emotion that bordered on worship. He retrieved a sterile bandage from his tactical vest, carefully and tenderly wrapping her palm. "You saved me. Again." Clara looked at him, her heart hammering against her ribs, but for the first time since that night in the alley, she wasn't afraid. "I think we saved each other, Davis." He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her neck, holding her as if she were the only real thing in a world of ghosts. "The war is over," he whispered against her skin, "and you will never see the inside of a cage or a freezing alleyway ever again." That is my vow. The transition from a freezing, desperate waitress to the queen of the supernatural underworld was not an overnight fairy tale. It was forged in blood, gunpowder, and the damp stone of George Island. Clara Brooks never returned to Gracie's diner, nor did she ever have to worry about an eviction notice again. Beside Davis Corvinus, she rebuilt the fractured vampire society, using her unique genetic legacy not as a weapon, but as a bridge to peace. The Caldwell-Brooks antigen eventually synthesized a cure for their weaknesses, ending centuries of predatory reliance on humanity. The ancient Lord Adrian Alaric watched his son rule with a wisdom and compassion the immortal world had never known. Clara learned that sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones lurking in the dark alleyways, but the ones who wear bespoke suits, and sometimes those are the exact monsters you fall helplessly in love with.